Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Wednesday, 13 November 2024. It is the 670th anniversary of the birth of Saint Augustine, who was born Aurelius Augustinus in Thagaste in the province of Numidia, then part of the Roman Empire, now part of Algeria, on this date in 354 AD. St. Augustine is known as one of the four fathers of the church, together with Gregory the Great, St. Ambrose, and St. Jerome. Of these four fathers of the church, St. Jerome and St. Augustine lived to see the sack of Rome by Alaric's Goths in 410 AD. St. Ambrose had lived earlier, dying before the sack of Rome, and Gregory the Great lived later when the event was already well over a century in the past. But for Jerome and Augustine, the sack of Rome was one of the most catastrophic events that they lived to see. Jerome was an elder contemporary of Augustine, and he felt the sack of Rome was a blow to the civilized world. Jerome's response to the sack of Rome was one of horror. He wrote, quote, "I was wavering between hope and despair, and was torturing myself with the misfortunes of other people. But when the bright light of all the world was put out, or rather, when the Roman Empire was decapitated, the whole world perished in one city. Who had believed that Rome, built up by that conquest of the whole world, had collapsed, that the mother of all nations became their tomb?" Unquote. Augustine's response was rather different, and it came much later. It's difficult to express the extent to which Rome was not only a city, but also a symbol. So that Rome was sacked, it was a symbol of wealth and a symbol of success and a symbol of order that was struck a mortal blow from which it did not truly recover. Rome had been a symbol of power for 800 years, and no one had imagined that the city could fall so far and so fast. And needless to say, there was a lot of finger pointing after the sack of Rome. Whose fault was it? Some blamed the Christians and the abandonment of the traditional gods of Rome. Augustine wrote his City of God in order to respond to these charges. In several episodes, I've mentioned that Augustine's City of God represents the origins of philosophy of history in the Western tradition. This isn't a view that's shared by everyone, and part of the reason that we don't usually think of St. Augustine as the starting point for philosophy of history is due to the relative lack of interest in Augustine's City of God through the greater part of the Middle Ages. It's strange that despite Augustine standing at the head of medieval philosophy, and much medieval philosophy taking the form of commentary on canonical texts, that there's no tradition of commentary on the City of God until late in the Middle Ages. I discussed this in my episode From Augustine to Machiavelli. A 1956 paper by Beryl Smalley mentions four commentaries by Oxford friars in the 14th century, being those of Nicholas Trevitt, Thomas Whalley, John Ridewell, and John Baconthorpe. Smalley argues that there was no need for a commentary, as those who knew the book understood its references very well. He wrote, quote, "De Civitate Dei had been studied in humanist circles in the 12th century. John of Salisbury quotes it frequently in his Polycraticus, and quotes it, moreover, as a source for the lore of classical antiquity. The few highly cultured scholars who knew and loved it in this period could understand it without any commentary. Neither John of Salisbury nor Otto of Freising, who modeled his history on the theme of the two cities, would need to have the allusions explained to them." Unquote. I think this kind of misses the point, because scholastic philosophers use the works of canonical texts as vehicles for expounding their own ideas and not so much as explaining them to others. Of course, there was a lot of explaining that went on, but when an original thinker wanted to present an original idea, he didn't do it by saying, usually my original idea. He did it by writing a commentary on somebody else who was already considered an authoritative source. So, Augustine wasn't given a commentary for the purpose of explaining him in the early Middle Ages, but he also wasn't given a commentary as a vehicle for someone else wanting to explain their original ideas. So that's why I say it's strange that there is no commentary tradition until the later Middle Ages. Given the preeminent position of Saint Augustine in medieval thought, it seems to me that Augustine would have been the perfect vehicle of this kind, but he didn't become so until the 14th century. And by this time, medieval philosophy had been developing for 1,000 years beyond Augustine, and the times they were a-changing. Aristotle now dominated the curricula of the medieval universities, and the 4 Oxford friars who wrote commentaries on Augustine's City of God were contemporaries and compatriots of William of Ockham, whose work would transform late medieval philosophy. So there's something of a missed opportunity in the earlier Middle Ages. Certainly, Augustine was overwhelmingly influential in the early church, and we can even say that his Christian Platonism was a formative influence in theology. But the missed opportunity was the absence of a robust commentary tradition on Augustine's City of God throughout the Middle Ages that could have made philosophy of history central to the Western philosophical tradition instead of being the marginal enterprise that it has been and continues to be. It wasn't until Voltaire in the 18th century that philosophy of history was made fully explicit. And by that time, it was made explicit in the intellectual climate of the Enlightenment, and European intellectual life had entered upon a new era. In a 2011 paper, Augustine's Philosophy of History, Rüdiger Bittner argued that it's anachronistic to speak of Augustine's philosophy of history because history did not mean for Augustine what it means for us. Bittner rightly points out, as I just noted, that philosophy of history was not used until Voltaire in the 18th century. Bittner gives a nice summary of the conception of history he attributes to St. Augustine, however. Quote, "So here is the overall Augustinian picture of history. It is a nested structure like a Russian doll. First, beyond all history, and indeed beyond time, is God, existing timelessly. What the word beyond means in this sentence remains unexplained, given it does not literally mean prior to or outside of. The idea is, at any rate, that God encompasses everything that is not God. Second, there is the realm of temporal things, the realm of history, as this word has been used here. History has a beginning, creation, and so it has a certain age now, even if we do not know what it is, but it will go on indefinitely. There is a reason there is history, but we do not know that either. Third, within history, there is human history. Later than and surrounded by history that merely unfolds in time the stable nature of things, human history introduces free will and thus novelty. No nature is realized in the workings of free will. Fourth, within human history, there is, surrounded by the uniform life in paradise and after judgment, the changing life of fallen humanity, which is unchanging, though, in its basic misery. Fifth, there is within this age of human misery that unique event in which God, who is beyond all history, enters history. This is the turning point of the whole structure. Thanks to it, a path is opened for humans to leave their misery and to enter a new life that is as much in accordance with the eternal God as is possible for a temporal creature of this kind." Unquote. I'm not sure in what way this conception of history is supposed to be incomprehensible to us today, because I think Bittner makes it pretty clear. It's true that most contemporary human beings don't hold this conception of history, but many still do. And moreover, it seems to me that it is a part of the remit of philosophy of history to offer an exposition of a concept of history, and Augustine articulated the concept of history that he developed. Others have used their treatises in philosophy of history to offer an exposition of their conceptions of history, often strikingly different from that of Augustine, and is left to later philosophers to sort them out. So you have many conceptions of history, many different conceptions of history, and hopefully we can come to understand them if we make the appropriate effort. I consider this a paradigmatic case of philosophical engagement. In my episode on Hannah Arendt, I discuss Arendt's distinction between an ancient and a modern conception of history. Arendt gives a detailed exposition of what she took to be the ancient conception of history, which is no longer our conception of history. But the act of giving an exposition implies that it is at least partially comprehensible to us, even if it feels alien, and a significant intellectual effort is necessary to think our way into this alien mode of thought. And so, too, a significant amount of effort may be required to think ourselves into Augustine's alien mode of thought. But we should, with that effort, be able to grasp his concept of history. If we think with Bittner that it's mistaken to attribute a philosophy of history to Augustine, we could create some new category, like, for example, providential historiography, to identify what Augustine was doing if he wasn't doing what we would today call history. But if we were to do this, then we would, of course, want to establish the relationship between philosophy of history and providential historiography, which would just be establishing the place of providential historiography within philosophy of history. And this is another example of what I have called mapping the conceptual space of history, which I particularly discussed in my episode on Jan Romein and theoretical history. Augustine's philosophical foundations were Greek, and he read and commented upon Roman historians in De Civitate Dei. And insofar then as our conceptions of history and philosophy were derived from the Greeks, which they are ultimately, Augustine is drawing on the same influences as our influences, although our influences are admittedly come much later in time and have passed through a greater number of transformations than they had in Augustine's time. So we're drawing on the same influences, and sometimes we're seeking to confute what came before, but we're working within the same framework of thought first formulated by Greek philosophers. It's interesting to compare Bittner's position with that of Karl Löwit. There's a sense in which Karl Löwit's denial of any legitimate philosophy of history is based on Augustine's theological conception of history not being a genuine philosophy of history. But Löwit holds that this original sin of philosophy of history that is based on a secularization of eschatology infects all later efforts, whereas Bittner seems to hold that a legitimate, or perhaps it would be better to say a modern philosophy of history, appears during the Enlightenment. So here we've got two different positions where Löwit, on the one hand, says that philosophy of history during the Enlightenment and after was not really legitimate because it was a secularization of Christian eschatology, but Bittner, on the other hand, saying that that we don't get philosophy of history until we get to the Enlightenment and something new enters into the intellectual life of Western civilization. Nevertheless, there continue to be providential philosophies of history even today, some drawing on Augustine, while others taking very different approaches. As, for example, in the 20th century, Reinhold Niebuhr had what we could call a providential philosophy of history, but it was not Augustinian in almost any respect. One of the reasons that I favor counting Augustine's City of God as the origin of philosophy of history is that it speaks directly to the problems that I find most interesting. So that's my personal prejudice at work. But again, it isn't isn't it a paradigmatic exercise of philosophical reason to entertain different ways of conceptualizing the task of philosophy of history and to understand the different intellectual consequences of differently conceiving the task of philosophy of history? Augustine, living as he did on the cusp of the ancient and medieval worlds, was the recipient of the entire tradition of ancient philosophy already in his time, being hundreds of years old. And in Augustine's day, Christianity had already been developing for 400 years, and the interaction between ancient philosophy and Christian theology was well underway. Almost all pagan philosophers had held that while human society passes through cycles of political regimes and cycles of growth and catastrophic destruction, the world itself, as the backdrop of these cycles, was understood to be eternal. The Christian revelation, on the other hand, insisted that the world had a beginning in time, so that by Augustine's day, there had already been several hundred years' worth of Christian philosophers who had started to challenge this ancient consensus. And this continued long after Augustine in the works of philosophers like Simplicius and John Philoponus. These are the problems that I find to be intensely interesting. You could argue that these are problems in philosophy of cosmology rather than philosophy of history. But if you have a naturalistic conception of history, then the history of the cosmos is the most comprehensive framework within which history transpires. And the naturalistic philosophy of history, parallel to the Matryoshka doll model of history that Bittner used to explain Augustine, has a hierarchy of histories embedded one within the other. In light of this naturalistic perspective in philosophy of history, many of Augustine's formulations can be applied mutatis mutandis to a naturalistic cosmology, making them immediately relevant, and all of Augustine's arguments still, in a sense, fresh today in our own time. And that is how I read Augustine. In City of God, Book 12, Chapter 11, titled "Of the Falseness of the History which Ascribes Many Thousands of Years to Times Gone By," Augustine argues against attributing too much time to finite earthly history. Trying to wedge all of known history into the Russian doll model that Bittner used, Augustine must ensure that history doesn't go on too long. And he writes, quote, "Such men are also misled by certain wholly untruthful things which purport to contain the history of many thousands of years of time. For we compute from the sacred writings that 6,000 years have not yet passed since the creation of man. Hence, the writings which make reference to far more than thousands of years than here are in vain and contain no trustworthy authority on the subject. But we shall not devote a great deal of argument to showing this. Rather, let us cite only that letter which Alexander the Great wrote to his mother Olympias, giving her the narrative which he had received from a certain Egyptian priest, which the latter had taken from the writings held to be sacred among the Egyptians, and which contained an account of kingdoms known also to Greek history," unquote. In the next chapter, Augustine argues against the plurality of worlds and cyclical cosmology. And this was a theme that he came back to time and again. He is, in a sense, the origin of this opposition between linear history and cyclical history, because the default position in classical antiquity, as I said earlier, was human history is cyclical. And Augustine insists both on the linearity of human history, the linearity of cosmic history, and the finitude of human history and the finitude of cosmic history. So he writes, quote, "There are others who, though they do not believe that this world is everlasting, are of the opinion either that it is not the only world, but that there are innumerable worlds, or that it is indeed the only one, but that it arises and perishes at fixed intervals, and that this happens innumerable time. But those who think in this latter way must necessarily confess that the race of human beings existed before there were other men to beget them. For, unlike those who think that there are floods and conflagrations which do not affect the entire world, these cannot suppose that when the whole world perishes, some men always remain, whose offspring then replenish the original population. Rather, since they believe that the world itself is reborn out of its own material, so also must they believe that the human race is first produced from the elements of the world, and that only then does the progeny of mortal man, like that of other animals, come teeming from their parents, unquote. All of these ideas are still with us and still familiar today, albeit formulated in different language. Those of us in the natural science tradition would affirm without hesitation that the human race is indeed produced from the elements of the world, though if one assumes an infinitude of worlds, all of which would produce human beings, then this would stretch credulity, and it would be easy to imagine Augustine making this argument or a similar kind of argument against such a conclusion. But he takes up the pagan philosophers who preceded him, and he meets them on their own ground and on their own terms. That is to say, he meets them on the grounds of Greek philosophy, and he argues in the tradition of Greek philosophy. An Augustinian today could, in the same spirit, take up the arguments of naturalistic philosophy and meet them on their own ground, as indeed many have and many do today. For my part, Book 12 is the most philosophically substantial book of the City of God. And here Augustine makes arguments against the common ideas in classical antiquity that I've been talking about: the infinity of worlds, the eternity of the world, and cyclical history. For Augustine, the world has a finite beginning in time, the result of God's creatio ex nihilo, and will have a definite ending in time. That's its finitude and its linearity. For Augustine, then, there are no infinity of worlds and no eternity of the world, nor is history cyclical. However, while the world isn't eternal, there is eternity that stands apart from the world, and this is where we get the motif that drives the entire book, the distinction between the city of man and the city of God. We could just as well call them the city of time and the city of eternity, because this is what the two cities symbolize for Augustine. Augustine could acknowledge the catastrophe that befell Rome in 410 AD, while at the same time affirming that these events in the city of man have no impact on the city of God. So even if the city of man is going through some very bad times, things are, in a sense, better than ever for the city of God, because is not the church growing? And the church is, you could say, the front office for the city of God within the city of man, the portal to eternity that is to be found in the temporal world. The relations between the city of God and the city of man, managed in this world by the church, are then a central feature of Augustine's conception of history. He's at great pains to have a detailed accounting of the relationships between time and eternity symbolized by the two cities, as, for example, in this passage from chapter 13 of Book 12. Quote, "For the eternity during which God refrained from creating man is so great that it stretches backward from us without any beginning. Therefore, no matter how great and ineffable the number of ages with which it is compared may be, such an expanse of time, so long as it has a definite conclusion, should not be regarded as being even so big as the smallest drop of water in the entire sea, or indeed in the ocean that surrounds the world. For of these two things, one indeed is extremely small and the other is incomparably great, but both are finite," unquote. Augustine is here drawing on the familiar ancient idea of the annihilation of the finite by the infinite. While one finite age may be vastly longer than some other finite age, any finite age is as nothing in comparison to the infinite. Therefore, the question asked by some ancient philosophers of Christians, why God chose to create the world when he did and not earlier or later, is dismissed by Augustine, because all finite times are equally fall short of infinitude. And Augustine continues, quote, "As to that expanse of time which comes forth from some beginning and is terminated by some end, no matter how great its extent, if it be compared with that which has no beginning, I do not know whether to say that we shall call it the very smallest thing or nothing at all. Suppose we take a finite expanse of time, and working backwards, Subtract the briefest moments from it, one by one, as you might take one day at a time from a man's life, starting with the day in which he now lives and going back to that of his birth. Even if the number of moments that you must subtract during this backward progression is so huge that no word can be found for it, this subtraction will nevertheless at some stage lead you back to the beginning. But now take a time which has no beginning, and working backwards, take away from it. I do not say tiny moments, one by one, or hours or days or months or years or even periods of years, but expanses of time so great that they cannot be counted by anyone whatsoever. Subtract expanses of time as great as that which we have supposed to be gradually consumed by the deduction of moments, and subtract them not once or twice or again and again, but forever. And what do you achieve or accomplish by doing this? You never reach a beginning, for there is no beginning. Unquote. Books 11 and 12 of the City of God are filled with discussions like this. I said earlier that much of Augustine can be reformulated to be relevant to our naturalistic conception of the cosmos, but in some cases, we don't even have to reformulate Augustine for him to be relevant. Chapter 6 of Book 11 is titled, "The Beginning of the World and the Beginning of Time Are the Same." And in this chapter, Augustine writes, quote, "The world was not created in time, but with time. The world was in fact made with time, if at the time of its creation, change and motion came into existence." Unquote. Recall in this context that Aristotle had said that time is the measure of motion. So if there is no motion to be measured, then there is no time. And this is a conception of time that's admirably tied to a metric. What I just read from Augustine, you could practically find word for word in a text on Big Bang cosmology, especially if you were to go back to a text from the 70s or 80s with the high point of Big Bang cosmology, which is often expressed in quasi-Augustinian terms, even if the authors didn't realize they were doing so. I don't myself agree with these arguments, but Augustine has given them clear and interesting formulations, and anyone with a different cosmology has an obligation to meet them on their own ground, just as Augustine met the philosophers of antiquity on their own ground. Another reason I have referred to Augustine as the origin of philosophy of history, and as an exception among philosophers of history, is that he is among the few philosophers of history to have expounded both a philosophy of history and a philosophy of time. And I think that we need to bring time and history together if we're going to make sense of them. I've mentioned that in several episodes. The cosmological conception of time we find throughout the City of God is one of the ways that Augustine bridges the gap between time and history. As I said earlier, it can be reformulated in naturalistic terms. And so you can unify every event in time, whether it's event on a cosmological scale or on a human scale. But Augustine also formulated a detailed theory of time in Book 11 of his Confessions, his unique work of autobiography out of the ancient world. In comparisons to Augustine's treatment of time in his City of God, time in his Confessions is much more personal and much more tied to the experiences of the individual rather than to cosmology as in City of God. Here again, we find the contrast between time and eternity that was the theme of the two cities. So this is from Augustine's Confessions, chapter 11. Quote, "Who shall hold it and fix it, that it be settled a while, and a while catch the glory of that ever-fixed eternity, and compare it with the times which are never fixed, and see that it cannot be compared, and that a long time cannot become long, but out of many motions passing by, which cannot be prolonged together, but that in the eternal nothing passeth, but the whole is present. Whereas no time is at all at once present, and that all time is past, is driven on by time to come, and all to come followeth upon the past, and all past and to come is created and flows out of that which is ever present. Who shall hold the heart of man and make it stand still and see how eternity, ever still standing, neither past nor to come, uttereth the times past and to come, unquote. Any adequate treatment of Augustine's philosophy of history should develop in parallel his cosmological conception of time in the City of God and his personal conception of time in his Confessions. I'm not prepared to do that at the moment, but I will only point out the need for this inquiry to be undertaken. Obviously, I've only scratched the surface on a few points of Augustine's influence here. I haven't even mentioned anything about his providentialism, which has been among the most influential doctrines of which he is the source and origin. One of the reasons that the City of God is such a big book is because it attempts to bring together all of these themes of time, history, cosmology, and divine providence. And that is a tall order. So happy birthday, Saint Augustine, and thanks for listening.